Hello, everybody. Holly here with Reality Sandwich, back for another Share Your Experience episode. I'm super excited about today because we just kind of kickstarted this Reality Sandwich book club where we're taking novels and pieces of literature and educational guides from readers in our community and kind of reading them internally and giving a little bit of a review. So most recently, I just absolutely devoured Death Trip, a post-Holocaust psychedelic memoir by Seth Lorinczi. And if you didn't immediately hear that title and say, this sounds amazing, like, does this cover not like draw you in? This is a fantastic cover set. It's so good.
Thank you.
I loved this book. So I'm really excited to chat with you today. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for asking. I'm super psyched to be here.
Awesome. So I do want to get into the book, but in true share your experience fashion, we like to kind of start with hearing about a psychedelic experience you've had. And I know you want to tell us a little bit about an experience you did write about in the book with 5-MeO DMT, which I'm thrilled to hear about. As I had mentioned to you earlier, most people that have experienced this plant are like, it was amazing and I have nothing to say because it's so hard to put into words.
I get it.
So, let's give me just a little bit of a backstory of how you ended up even getting to this plant medicine, because it is not a first time user sort of a substance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as we'll get into later, I mean, the book sort of follows my dissolution from struggling middle-aged person into psychonaut, for lack of a better term, but really someone who understands that he needs to make sense of his buried backstory, his family's backstory, in order to make sense of his present day life. And I was very lucky in the course of writing the book to be connected with a psychedelic therapist who was trustworthy and had good sort of ethical boundaries, and just sort of reading the room of my own experience at a certain point suggested, well, if this is what you're looking for, I think I have something that could help. And so the 5-MeO experience, I think, is actually it's one of the last medicine experiences in the book, but it follows MDMA and ayahuasca in this sort of like ramping up of the psychedelic experience, if that makes sense.
Both of which you'd also experienced multiple times.
Yeah,
So it's not, yeah. So you'd been, taking journeys prior to coming across this substance.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Interestingly, I do know people for whom 5 was their first psychedelic experience, which sounds utterly terrifying to me, but who knows? It takes all types.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in some sense, it's like, because it's so much shorter lived, somewhere in that like 15 to 30 minute time frame, it sounds a little less intimidating than, say, like 6 to 8+ hours with ayahuasca, right? You'd think like, oh, well, it can't be that bad. I've never tried it myself. I've sat with many other plant medicines, but not 5-MeO DMT. So I don't have a personal frame of reference for the physiological and mental differences of how to relate the two. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, how did you ingest this substance? What's the come up like? Walk me through the experience.
Well, I'll say one thing just to backtrack for a second. Like many medicines, it is also very dose dependent. So as I found out later, there is actually a way you can use this carefully and consciously in this kind of dance with dissolution, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you my experience. So at this point in the book, my wife and I we've had many journeys. We've fallen into MDMA world and ayahuasca world. And as a teenager, I also used LSD quite a bit. That was my medicine at that age. But there was something I was looking for that I had never found in any of these medicines, and that was leaving myself behind. I'm cerebral. I'm probably fairly neurotic, to be honest. And there's always this sense of an internal watcher, sort of critiquing everything I do in the world. And I know I'm not alone. Many people experience that. But my life experience was just that was really persistent. There was really no way to separate from that, or even to understand that it might be a separate voice. It might not be me who is that sort of internal watcher. So the way I ingested toad, there was a couple times, 5-MeO, DMT slash toad. I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that toad is harvested from the Sonoran desert toad. It's a toxin that's secreted by it. Um, the molecule is 5-MeO DMT, and it can also be synthesized. And I have worked with the synthetic version as well, which many people are in favor of because it doesn't freak out or kill toads, which frankly is a good thing in my view. This first time, I believe it was actual toad venom that I was working with, and um, the guide we were working with placed a very specific dose on a bed of inert herbs in a little pipe. And I was instructed to smoke this and to inhale it and hold it in as long as I could. I wish I had the language to describe that taste, because there's something very, very specific, almost as if you burned cornstarch and inhaled it. I know that sounds odd, but like I said, there's a very,
Very specific. Yeah.
very characteristic flavor I associate with that. And I mean, even imagining it now kind of brings me back to that state. I had enough toad. That's interesting. Actually that one night I had an instance in which I inhaled a dose and I sort of lifted halfway off, and I was in a place that was not unfamiliar. I mean, for those of us who have experienced the psychedelic state, which I imagine is literally every single person listening to or watching this right now, but there was a sort of tetheredness. Like I was floating somewhere and I was still on the ground. I was still on Earth as well. And as you said, the experience is pretty short. I mean, I think it's actually between maybe 5 and 20 minutes. I don't honestly know. Um, but I returned, and then later that evening, I tried a second dose, and this one was quite a bit stronger. And here's what I'll say. Psychedelics of various kinds bring you to unusual places, unusual sort of internal rooms, and also with some medicines, the sense that you are really accessing some other dimension, some other world. I think it's a lot of people's experience of ayahuasca, for instance, or slash DMT. Here's what happened for me in Toad. I very quickly, I'd say within a couple of seconds, found myself floating in something akin to outer space, except there was no detail of any kind. There was nothing to orient myself to. It was as if I was just swaddled in black velvet. And that's almost saying too much, because that implies that I could see or sense anything, which I couldn't. I mean, it was really just an enveloping nothingness that I've never experienced before or since. And my first reaction was fear. Um, I don't think I had the consciousness to wonder if this is what dying might be like. But imagine you've lost every single reference point to the world you know. It's an unsettling experience. But in the next instant, I recognized that internal voice I was referring to earlier, that sort of sense of an inner critic and an inner watcher, was gone for the very first time in my life. And what that told me was that it was a it was a it was a program. It was like a bit of software. It was not me, but it was something that had been encoded in me, in my life experiences, and I believe in the experiences of the people who raised me too. And that meant it wasn't me. It wasn't real, and I didn't have to believe it. And those are the only conscious thoughts I had in that experience. I mean, really, like it was almost like being removed from thought itself. Again, it's difficult to describe. But I'll say this: when I came back, which seemed like a few seconds later, and I sort of realized I was on Earth, I was on the floor, I was with my wife and with the guide. As I sort of came back to this world, I said something which it feels kind of trite saying it out loud now, but I think it's significant. I said, I know this sounds crazy, but I feel like I've been given my life back. And I really did feel that, and I still do. You know, we all grow up surrounded by programming, by our culture, by our family systems, and we absorb so much of who we are through that. I'd say a significant amount in pre-verbal ages as well. We're sort of watching how people react to us. But that cutting of that connection between me and that internal critic was really, really significant. And it's not as though that critic isn't still there, trust me. But I know that it's not me, and I know that I don't have to believe it. And that's a really, really huge deal. So
Yeah, because
that's the most concise answer I can give you.
no, that's great. I love that. I'm trying to, yeah, transport myself into this type of a void, and I'm thinking of my inner critic right now, who's, always right there too, right? And
Mm-hmm.
kind of like the program that's running in the background. So now, post this experience, as you walk through your daily life, are you able to consciously recognize which voices are not you and just ignore them, honor them, turn them off, work through them?
Right.
Is it all of those things?
I'd say it's a little of all of it. I mean, here's what I'll say. I think before then, my experience was that those voices were so deep inside me, it's like they were welded to my spine. Like they are part of who I am. And I cannot navigate the world without those critics, those protectors, really, trying to keep me safe from harm, from humiliation, from all the things that all the services that those voices render. My experience now is that they're still there, but they're in front of me. Like they're not in my body anymore. I see them, and I see them for what they are. And I still, again, I still react to them. I'm still a nervy guy. I'm still, sometimes I feel like I'm just learning how to get along with other humans, and I'm nearly 54 years old. But I see that it's not me. And just that knowing is a huge, huge deal.
So, how did this experience with Toad, how is this like revelation that you took away here different from maybe some of the core messages you experienced with ayahuasca and MDMA?
You know, I'll say this, like the guide who I work with in many of these experiences in the book, her opinion is that all these medicines take you to the same place eventually. And I think there's some truth to that. But they are all working on different aspects of our personalities and our psyches, and of course our brains too. I mean, the chemistry, the neurochemistry is different for all of them. Each of those medicines illuminated something really critical. I mean, the book is set up as a hero's journey, and that progression of medicines is no accident. I am sort of on this path trying to understand really where I came from and how to change my circumstances. Um, MDMA and ayahuasca work on different aspects of relationship, of partnership, of family history, of species history. But 5-MeO is, some people refer to it as kind of the source code for all those medicines. And I think there's something in that. There's nothing experiential in it, in my opinion. It is simply, it was just a master override for all the programming that had come before. And again, I wasn't erased, but I was reset in a pretty profound way. And so I didn't bring anything tangible back except that, that sort of deeply held sense that maybe what I'd taken to be true was actually just an illusion.
I love how it felt like I was reading two books when I was reading. Part of that is your writing style, and part of it is because it was kind of two stories that were coming in and out of each other the entire way through, right? Where on the one hand, we're really talking about you, your life, your wife, your marriage, and your career and psychedelic breakthroughs. On the other hand, we're talking about you on like this investigatory hunt into your family's history to take a look at things like epigenetics and ancestral trauma. And the weaving is so beautiful because, like I said, it felt like two stories. They're coming in and out of each other. There's correlations, but I think they almost could have existed on their own, which just made it like such a page turner because I needed to get to the next piece. Oh, where's, okay, he's getting on the flight. He's going to Hungary. What's okay? But oh, wait, we're back in Portland. And I thought that was so fantastic. So what I'm curious about, I mean, I'm curious about so many things, but what I want to know is, did you find that the act of writing this book was cathartic, or did it bring you closer to maybe some inner pain? And where did those two overlap as you were taking this
Mm,
journey?
thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel emotion hearing that because they're both true, for sure. Um, I'd sort of made some stabs into my backstory, but this was a real, prolonged deep dive, and it was painful, and there's a lot of my family story I actually had to leave out to to protect people who didn't want to be talked about, who for whatever reason cannot face that trauma. But I'll say this: there's there's something about, so medicines like MDMA, they help us metabolize trauma because they make it safe for us to re-examine those stories and to file them, meaning out of sort of immediate short-term memory and into archiving. Basically, like we process those traumas and we're able to store them where they're allowed to be. There's something traumatic and awful that happened, but that's the past. That's not how we're looking through our lenses today. And in my experience, writing memoir is the exact same thing. You're finding a safe way because you have some distance on the material. You're finding a safe way to sort of pick it up and hold it in your hand and turn it around and examine it. And in doing so, you change the memory. That's how memory works. We don't remember the same thing each time we remember it. We remember the last time we remembered it. And in so doing, we change it. So handling these stories and getting to put them down on the page, and of course, revising them many times, I noticed something interesting happening, that I was taking charge of my story in a way I never had before. And of course, the trick is, I want to be truthful and I want to tell the story as I understand it as clearly as I can. But I also admit that telling the story changes it, and getting to write a new narrative about things that were kind of unambiguously awful, both in my personal backstory and especially in my family's backstory. I mean, you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. Getting to hold those and shape those, tell them, and then sort of file them where they belonged was deeply, deeply healing. And in fact, in the last months, I've been working with other presenters to do teachings on writing your story. They're not aimed solely at writers. They're actually just aimed at all the people who come up to me after book events saying, I have a story, but I don't know how to tell it, or I never find the time to write it, which is not a problem of time. It's a problem of not being able to step close to that. So what I'm doing now is helping people find that, helping people get closer to the stories because it heals them. It heals families and it heals people. It's no more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's something that I've noticed just talking with people about their psychedelic experiences too. It transports me back to so many experiences I have in either kind of stirs the medicine again within me and reminds me of something I'd forgotten about the experience, or helps me integrate something that someone else processed in a different way that I hadn't considered. So I consider these like cathartic, just even talking.
Mm.
This is a part of the integration, right? Continuing
Oh,
to
for
talk.
sure.
So yeah, I like how you position that, as writing the book itself is a part of your integration. And
Oh,
it's,
yeah.
yeah, I love that. Um, so you take us on a trip to Hungary to kind of explore your family's past. You go to Buda, you go to Pest, you look at old family homes. I mean, this is like for a historian, this is like a dream trip. And for most people who are at all interested in family history, same, like, and you'd been there before, but this was different. You went with your sister for a brief period of time, and then you were on your own. I'd love to hear a little bit about how the landscapes and putting yourself physically in places where family members had stood before influenced your sense of self back here in the States, and what you took with you there that maybe shifted how you behaved here.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think when I'm in Europe, and especially Hungary, I've been twice now in my life, it's like finding a whole other wing of the house inside me. And I recognize, oh, these experiences actually have meaning for me. I don't know quite how to put them into words, but like you say, standing in the same place that I know my father, my aunt, my grandparents stood, walking across the bridge that my father walked across, and what happened one day after he walked across that bridge. Um, all these things are really stirring, and I recognize that my story is far deeper and wider and vaster than I ever could have imagined. Um, and I find that really helpful. I think since I was a young boy, I always felt the sense that life kind of didn't make sense. Like there was something chaotic and maybe cruel about it, and no one was telling me the truth. It was as if there was like a curtain and I couldn't quite see but behind it. So going to these places and understanding that I fit in a line of people, both in my family and sort of in the human story too, is really grounding. Um, the world becomes a little less senseless. I'll say this too, what it makes me hyper aware of is that so many of us walk through our lives without that sense of grounding, without the sense that they came from someplace, that they're related to people who are maybe now long dead. But it just, for me, it illuminates how much we've lost this sense of lineage. And I think that's an American problem because that's America's promise, right? You can come here and rewrite your story. And that's exactly what my family did. I mean, that's living memory. My father came here in 1948. It's not very long ago. So I'm aware that I have a backstory, and I'm aware that many of us feel like they don't, and they feel really ungrounded. And that helps me when I'm relating to people who feel like they're not making sense of their lives, to help maybe prompt them and lead them back in time and understand, no, you are connected to people. It's easy to forget that, um, especially in an age of handheld computers and you know being bombarded by information on a pretty constant basis. But you do come from someplace. You're connected to someplace, and you're connected to people, and maybe that can give others this sort of sense of grounding and safety that it gives me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely makes sense. I certainly felt like reading through this, I wanted to reach out to my grandparents that are still alive and chat with my aunts and uncles who are maybe more I have a couple family members that are really into ancestry, and
Yeah.
it made me realize, I haven't asked enough questions that I want to know before these people are gone, and I can't
Yeah.
ask anymore. And I might not go to Sweden and Germany to figure it out, but I would like I would like to learn what I can from those that know. And I think you're right. There's so much maybe about, yeah, this new life that so many of our ancestors started here in this country, where we lost the storytelling. It just didn't pass through the generations. And that's been something I'd say, even just in the last handful of years, my mom, watching her parents age, has really been also paying more attention to that, getting more stories, sharing them with me and my brother. And it's been heartbreaking and
Hmm.
interesting and inspiring, because there tougher times happened decades before. Life seems a lot simpler and easier compared to what some of the things my great grandparents experienced.
Yeah.
And I love this theme of talking about generational trauma, because I see it when I hear my mom and my grandmother tell me these stories about trials and tribulations they have, or issues they've faced through their life. And I'm like, holy shit, I have that anxiety. Why do I have that? Like, I'm not worried about this thing that you are, but I can feel it right here. I don't want that anymore. And that's something too that when I first sat with ayahuasca, I didn't know that that was what was happening until years later, when I started having these conversations with my mom, and like these little light bulbs started going off. I'm like, oh my gosh, that awful, horrendous night of vomiting was actually your stuff that
Yeah.
I was given an opportunity to cut out of my life, but I didn't know it then. And
I,
that's just, it's so interesting to me.
I resist the urge to do what I call receipt keeping, basically going back and trying to say, well, no, this event leads clearly to this feeling, or that, this,
Mhm.
you know, that's interesting for some people, especially in ayahuasca, people have sort of, past life experiences come up, and that's all well and good. I'm looking more kind of for the themes, I don't need to know the exact date, but yeah, I mean that's just how it works, and it's interesting. I think even people outside of medicine world have told me, well, when you do this work, I mean, the work of looking at your ancestors and trying to place yourself in time, you're healing the line. You're healing yourself, but you're healing the line back in time too. And it gives me heart that even non psychedelic people are picking up on that, because I think it's true.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. I think that's maybe where my mom is at too. She's a very not psychedelic person, but she's a spiritual person, and
Yeah,
I think the work she's doing is in that effort. And I'm like, oh, thanks. All right, cool. We can both work on this
yeah.
together
Thank
then.
you.
That's awesome. Thanks, mom.
Yeah.
Um, one thing I do see in certain conversations in this space, talking about this family legacy, comes down to responsibility.
Hmm.
Where do you, as you explore trauma, at no point in your book did I feel like you were shifting responsibility for your life actions or behaviors on your family
Hmm.
lineage. Is that something that came up for you writing the book and looking at this as like, I want to honor my family history, but I also want to take personal responsibility for my own life?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like, job number one, my life is my life, and you the catastrophic mistakes that I've made are mine. No one else's. But here's the thing too. I mean, the book, actually, before it was called Death Trip, was called Fatherland, because it really is in many ways about trying to discover who my father actually was and sort of put him to rest, even though he's been gone decades now. Uncovering these stories about him are painful. I mean, they confirm things I sort of always suspected but couldn't quite name. Uh, and these aren't necessarily his failings, but the effect of unmetabolized trauma. I mean, these are people coming out of truly horrendous life circumstances and having no sort of social or emotional architecture to deal with it, right? I mean, this is the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. So, I mean, all this to say that it's tender to get to know the people who raised me in retrospect, because I can both see more clearly the ways they did fail me, and also the ways in which they were simply acting out their part. And again, like the guiding principle the whole time is no one did anything to me. I am me. I have all this information at hand now. It's up to me what to do with it. And I mean, I would say, as someone who is reasonably experienced in the psychedelic realm, I'd repeat what so many others have said, which is that once you see these things, you can't unsee them. So it's my job to do something positive and useful with it, and that's my goal.
You mentioned a bit ago about how talking about memory and how we're kind of layering on memories and how, I think people have different memories of specific experiences. It's kind of a game I like to play with my little brother, who's almost 7 years younger than me. And I'll bring up something and I'll say, tell me what you remember about this event or whatever, because it's fun to hear what we each remember. I always say, I think we had two different sets of parents growing up because we were
You
far enough
did,
apart in age, and they were just different to us.
yeah.
Um, so I really liked the part about kind of your relationship with your sister shifting, and also how she had very different perspective of your father and your upbringing than you did. Can you tell me a little bit about how your trip together to Hungary changed your relationship, and maybe what happened since then? How has your relationship changed with your sisters? Does she like the book? What,
Yeah.
how has that transpired?
Well, I'm glad to say she does,
Good.
which is helpful.
Uh-huh. It's a good start.
Yeah, it's a good start. Yeah, I mean, that was so fascinating to me. I mean, because, you know, your childhood memories are really like that's when your lenses, and I'm gesturing to my glasses, but like the lenses we all wear, that's when they're being formed, right? Like those distortions and those scratches and those perspective changing elements that we don't even realize are there anymore, right? That's just how we see the world. And it does take something, in my experience, like psychedelics to help you see that no, these are just distortions in your lens. Like that's not the objective truth. And so getting to talk with my sister Stacy and understand that her opinions were just as set in stone as were mine, and her experiences were no less real than mine, that was really confronting. And yeah, as you point out, like there's a long section of the book where we're kind of trying to work out in real time, like who's right, as if either of us can be. I think what's really sweet about my relationship with my sister post trip is that now we have that depth to call upon, right? Like we did go really deep in Hungary, and that was deeply healing for our relationship. I think for each of us individually, and now we know it's there. And we've always loved each other, but sometimes, you know, as is the case with family, getting to sort of relate in the 3D level is hard. It just is. Family's hard. So that's a gift to me. And the last thing, like the more specific one, is that when I write about our childhood and the sense of growing up in that house, the house is almost as much of a character as any human in the book, and that's how childhood is, right? You like places have sentience, trees are alive, rooms are alive, stuffed animals are alive. So calling back that sense of that house and what it felt like growing up there, I think has been really impactful for her. She said something to the effect of, "Oh, you're naming, like you nailed it, like you're naming my experience of being in that house," and that's been really, I think, productive for her too. So that's a sweet little gift.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, so how have your it's like summation of psychedelic experiences shifted perhaps how you now parent? Like what has changed
Oh
in
no,
examining the relationship of your parents to you and now you to your daughter?
the the two most important things by far are, I mean, one I named earlier, just recognizing that what I'm experiencing is not the objective truth. It's my truth, it's what I'm experiencing, but that's not everyone's truth. Letting go of that has been hard, to say the least, but it's been really, really useful. as a parent who, yeah, I mean, when my daughter is 17 and a half now, and before she was born, I kind of naively assumed that she would just be like a small version of me. And as she as she constantly reminded me when she was a young person, I'm my own person. And we can sort of know that on an intellectual level, but having the psychedelic experience where everything is so embodied and so felt and so somatic really helps with that. Um, the other thing I'll say is, I don't know if this, I can't separate if this came specifically from psychedelics or just from growing up. I mean, they're intertwined. But letting go my end of the rope, meaning, especially with my wife, and remember, we come to psychedelics in deep crisis. We're about to get divorced. Uh, Understanding that we're just living out these stories of who we are, who the other one is, how we're supposed to relate to each other, allowed both of us to put down the rope, to understand that these weren't things worth fighting for. We're fighting over projections, not any kind of objective truth. And extending that to my daughter, and being okay with being wrong. Um, I think culturally that's something that's maybe challenging, especially for fathers. Um, it's really necessary. I get it wrong sometimes, and being able to name that to her and apologize uh, when I've overstepped or when I've played it wrong. That's a real gift to all of us.
You also wrote somewhere in the book how you had kind of taken her aside at some point and let her know that, just a bit of an education, like these are some substances I'm using to help me with XYZ. This is what they do. Has that continued as she's gotten older now into her teenage years? Has that dialogue continued? Like, is there an open curiosity on her end, or is it just kind of like, whatever, that's what my dad is, it's not taboo. It's just a thing now. Yeah.
It's kind of more the latter, honestly. Um, it was really important for me to let her sort of understand the water she swam in. I mean, it's no accident that the age of initiation in a lot of cultures is around 13, and she was 13 when we went on a long walk, and I said, "This is what's been going on in our lives. You've probably noticed some things are different." And she did know, of course, she just didn't know why. But it's really important for me that she understand the water she swam in. That the overculture, for the most part, does not approve of this. This is a kind of inward looking and soul searching that is not really okay, uh, unless it's sort of in service to the juggernaut of self help, which I won't touch on here. Um, but I wanted her to know where this lived in the overculture, and then to come to her and say, "I get that, and that's fine, and you, you have to navigate the world as an individual. However, there are these other ways of looking too, and these other ways of being, and a lot of our world now is constructed of people who are on the same path." And yeah, I'm so grateful that she could hear that, and I think I imparted that in a safe and meaningful way. But yeah, it's these days it's sort of like, I don't think she's. It's just sort of like, it's something her parents do, so it's like by nature not cool.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Doesn't have that same intrigue as it would
No,
if it were
no
not talked
way.
about at home.
Yeah.
Um, well, I have one last question for you. What do you hope that your readers take away from Death Trip?
So, I mean, at the very least, I hope it's a good read, because I was looking when I was writing it, I was kind of looking around at the landscape, and I felt that there was plenty of sort of like straight nonfiction about these worlds. I mean, Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind was published as I was writing this, um, but no one was treating it with a kind of literary rigor. And I'm not a trained writer; like, I didn't grow up, imagining I'll be a writer someday. But I'm looking around and I'm seeing all these people, myself included, really having their lives rewritten in a major way. And no one's talking about this from a literary lens or an artistic lens, or very few people are. And I thought that was a challenge. Like, I'd like to make a good story out of this and see if I can kind of translate this world for others. But the other thing I'll say is, to me, the greatest gift of publishing this book is that I now get notes, some from people I've known for decades, some from people I've never met, who say, I see myself in this book. And that is a huge gift to me because, for all the specifics of the story, yes, it's a Holocaust story, it's a World War II story, it's a Jewish story, it's a human story. It's really a story about not belonging and trying to find your way towards communion with the people around you. And when people tell me they get that, that's a big deal to me. That's a gift.
I love that. Oh, thank you so much. Feels like the perfect place to close this. I just want to thank you so much for sharing this information, and I definitely will drop the link to your book below. I hope people pick it up. It was fantastic. I will keep it on my bookshelf and pass it along to others along the way. So thank you so much, Seth.
Perfect. Oh, thank you so much, Holly. I really appreciate it.